He had his gun, so he just swung it open.
I start to notice that, the atmosphere feels a little bit weird.
First thing he seen was this 6.5 foot tall, broad shoulder, dark hair. That freaked him out.
We hadn't talked to her about like life and death and what any of that means. She's 3 years old,
So we turned around. Suddenly there's a whole tree falling across the road.
And she was describing to us that, there was a deceased person that she could see visually.
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, where we tackle the ever-expanding history and mystery of monsters and supernatural madness every Monday. You can find us at CryptidClues.ca for more information, or even check out exclusive content and support us at patreon.com/CryptidClues.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of Cryptid Clues. I am your host, Taylor, and for today's episode, we're going back beneath the waves to explore another underwater cryptid. However, before we venture into that, check out our feeds because last week we dropped in an episode exploring a couple of Sasquatch encounters, whilst prior to that, both Reuben and myself discussed the Fermi paradox, along with our thoughts on the whole Miami extraterrestrial debacle that unfolded. So, should you wish, however, to reach us directly, albeit to share an experience or just to say hi, you can send us an email, cryptidclues@gmail.com. Without further ado, let's get into this. So, Lake Utopia, New Brunswick, Canada. Reaching a maximum depth of about 28.7 meters, equivalent of 94.16 feet. It spans approximately 7 kilometers long, which is 4.3 miles, and between 0.8 and 2.8 kilometers. So this is like 0.49 miles and 1.73 miles in width. Being quite a popular recreational spot overall, to the west of the lake you have Canal Beach, most popular for swimming. Heading north, you have Grey Mountain, with much of this northern area remaining untouched, with the exception of a couple cabins, back then, I should say. And this area began to slowly start to change hands a few times. And that started from the 1940s, flowing towards the early 2000s. And what originally was, at the time, an unpopular swim spot that was called Scouts Beach, that area started to change from a camp to a party spot, and finally, as of late, is now a private beach with restricted access to the public use. However, there is a number of homes that have been constructed in behind. To the east, there was much development between the 1900s into the 1960s, with a popular beach, concession stands, and actually amusement park rides. Much of the eastern shore has now, however, been developed into cottages and year-round homes. So, upon being a favorable fishing destination as well, possible catches include smallmouth and largemouth bass, trout, perch, river eels, landlocked Atlantic salmon, and fall fish. But one very interesting thing about this lake is that it actually drains via the canal into the MacLeod River. I'm pretty sure I said that correctly on the first go. Now, this flows through an approximate 10 kilometers, 6.2 miles of length to the Bay of Fundy. In short, this lake connects to the ocean. Now, Lake Utopia isn't, of course, the only lake flowing into this river either. In total, the MacLeod River has over 57 lakes that connect to it, and an astounding 103 tributaries. And tributaries are basically smaller bodies of water like rivers and streams and such. That is a plethora of different channels connecting into this main river. So with all that being said, I imagine how you're probably wondering by now why this history lesson, what's the catch here? Well, Lake Utopia is reportedly home to another Canadian underwater cryptid called Old Ned. Local reports claim that this lake is inhabited by a sea monster. While Old Ned is its more common name, officially it's dubbed as the Lake Utopia lake monster. And the legend goes on as such. Long ago, 2 Maliseet natives were canoeing on the lake when suddenly the monster appeared and chased them from one end to the other. Once Europeans began to arrive in the area during the late 18th century, this legend continued and gained new attention every few years. To sort of side tangent here, this origin reminds me very much of our own local Ogopogo, where hundreds of years ago the Okanagan First Nations would seek safe passage across Okanagan Lake. They referred to it as a water spirit. And this water spirit required a sacrifice upon each passing. So in order to safely cross, they would bring a small animal to kill and drop it into the lake for the creature. So moving on from that, but just bear that in mind, getting into basic reports and descriptions of this creature, Old Ned, it's described as being a fairly bulky thing, reaching at least 20 plus feet in length, has a very large head dominating its front, and is reddish brown or dark red in color. Supposedly, the last sighting reported of this creature was submitted to a cryptozoologist named Norma Stewart. This report was in the year 2000. However, the last published newspaper report is still clocked in at the year 1996. Norma's conclusions is that this creature actually travels back and forth between Lake Utopia and the Atlantic Ocean every 3 to 5 years. Whether that's for breeding and or feeding, that's up to interpretation. It's worth noting that no impression of viciousness has stemmed from any reports, but on the note of reports, let's dive into some of those now. So, our first one, 1867. Sawmill workers claim to see something about 30 feet long, which is 9.1 meters, and 10 feet, 3 meters, wide, thrashing in the lake. Similar reports begin to follow along in the next couple of days. A year later, 1868, a St. Croix Courier reporter says that he and one other witness saw the monster. 1872, natives describe a terrifying monster with a large head and bloody jaws following their canoe. 1891, William Francis Ganong records in his notebook a description of a monster provided by a lumberman who claimed to have seen it 20 years prior. It was dark red in color. The part showing above the water was about 20 feet long and as big as around like a small hogshead. It was much like a large eel. 1969. The St. John Evening Times Globe reports on an interview with Mrs. Fred McKillop Sr., who said she saw a huge creature 18 years earlier. It looked like a huge black rock. It moved up and down the lake, boiling and churning the water, making great waves. 1982. Sherman Hatt says he and his family saw a large creature that looked like a submarine coming out of the water with spray on both sides. It was about 10 feet, 3 meters long, and put me in mind of the back of a whale. 1996. Roger and Lois Wilcox were canoeing on the lake when they saw ripples break the placid surface 100 meters away from them. It was heading toward Cannonball Island, which is a common monster sighting spot. Wilcox reported the monster as being 40 to 50 feet, which is 15 meters long, undulating upward, not sideways. So there is a recurring theme here with underwater cryptids in these major water bodies, one that is rooted strongly in centuries of legends passed down through generations. While the main focus on this episode is, of course, Old Ned, I wanted to add a secondary notion here that's attached to both the Great Lakes and Indigenous peoples' mythology. Existing in opposition of the Thunderbird, which that being is a power of air, this is called an underwater panther, also originally known as Mishibizu. That is one of the many names that it has. There is a plethora of other titles for it, which all share similar translations into night panther, underground wildcat, and so forth. This being was detailed as a culmination of multiple animal parts. Body of a feline of some sort, horns of a deer or bison, and covered in scales all over its back, which would lead into very, very long tails. While other animal parts are present, overall it maintains a serpentine representation that has the capabilities to roar and hiss the sounds of storms of rushing rapids. Now, this creature was said to live in the deepest parts of the lakes and rivers. While some viewed Mishibizu as benevolent, others viewed them as malevolent. Mishibizu is known for guarding vast amounts of copper in Lake Superior and the Great Lakes region. And indigenous residents prior to the 17th century had been mining copper, but once Europeans arrived and began doing the same, that mining became extremely forbidden. Now, the underwater panther is well represented through history, though, whether it be with pictograms or stitched into different types of bags. In more recent times, you can actually see that the Canadian Museum of History actually has an underwater panther in its coat of arms. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there is one pictograph specifically that I wanted to highlight, and it will be attached in the blog on our website, and if you're watching the YouTube version, you'll see it appear right now. But it details a Mishibizu as well as two other serpents in a canoe. This can be found in one of the most famous pictograph sites in all of Canada, Ottawa Bay. And this is actually within Lake Superior Provincial Park. The site's name translated from Ojibwe is the Adorned Rock on Agawa Lake. Discovered in 1958 by Selwyn Dudney, the majority of these paintings in the Agawa site are dated as being from the 17th and 18th centuries. While the underwater lynx is of primary focus, the other two serpent beings adjacent really strike me with intrigue. And as Reuben has mentioned on previous episodes, either throughout biblical depictions like tapestries and such, or other prominent forms of displayed architecture, now we can see that these ancient and old depictions, I personally like to prescribe to the theory of drawing what you see, and maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what this is, or should I say something that had happened here with these pictographs. Perhaps back centuries ago, underwater serpents like the Ogopogo and Old Ned were seen, and this is how they were documented along with the underwater lynx, all classified by local cultures as being water spirits. The idea that there's not just one representation in this pictograph, but possibly multiple mysterious sea creatures together, that's something else that I find really fascinating as well. It's just overall just a really intense pictograph to look at that's just been painted onto the rock. I love learning about these new underwater cryptids, and while I share no disregard for believing in a Bigfoot or a Dogman, there is something rooted in creatures from below the depths that I think even the more skeptical mind would maybe yield to believing in. Of course, you need definitive evidence, and not that I speak for anyone regarding that and their beliefs, but when you look at our oceans, for example, as of 2023, we've mapped out around 24.9% of the seafloor using sonar equipment. Note this number does vary depending on the different agencies' data that exists out there and the different agencies that are out surveying the seafloor. Now, I just want you to bear in mind that is mapped, very different from exploring it. So if we break that number down further, only 5% of the ocean has actually been explored using submersibles and other remotely operated vehicles, or scuba divers, I guess, too, would fall into that category. And then there's the rabbit hole of oceans beneath our oceans, like we mentioned earlier, lakes connecting to oceans, massive underground caverns and systems that all intertwine. The list goes on and on and on for theories and concepts. But ultimately, a sad reality that I hate to apply, but maybe this is where my reasoning of realism kind of rests on this topic, is that the Loch Ness Monster, and unfortunately maybe the Ogopogo as well, have perhaps existed at one point and either died out or used one of these routes to leave the area, and maybe they just never came back. I mean, one of the explanations with Old Ned, as we already discussed, is Old Ned leaves, 3 to 5 years, comes back, mating, feeding, all that kind of stuff. And maybe these creatures just decide not to. There is also the possibility that if the Earth is in constant, well, not if, the Earth is in constant motion. So if underwater creatures use tunnels that result in cave-ins from an earthquake, possibly, they could be trapped and never found, thus hiding all evidence of its existence. I do believe in underground caverns and cave systems and networks, and so if you are using them to traverse, I don't think it would take much for a passageway to be sealed off after an earthquake. It would be a very simple thing, and it would be very unfortunate. With a lack of sightings in today's society, and even further lack of lake attacks by creatures other than sturgeons, I should say. Sturgeons seem to be pretty pesky at causing a stir with human swimmers. I think we are entering a time where our focus may shift away from lakes to oceans regarding underwater unknowns, particularly cryptids. But that won't pull me away from doing, again, future episodes of investigating into other lake cryptids, because this is just my perspective. I try not to be too negative or imposing of my own thoughts with Cryptid Clues, and we like to present you with the information so you can trek on and build your own perspectives and theories. That's very, very important to me and to Reuben as well. So that's why we'll keep pursuing and looking into other underwater cryptids that exist still in lakes and exploring more with what's going on in the oceans. And it's not just cryptids. Me and Reuben have mentioned this in passing before, but there are very interesting USOs, unidentified submersible objects. And I'm not sure it's not a term that you hear a lot of. Usually people are accustomed to the UAPs or UFOs, but USOs are a thing. And there seems to be a prominent amount of alien activity. I shouldn't say alien. I apologize. Unidentified flying object activity surrounding oceans, where they would just be dropping down, doing something, and shooting back up. There's an episode recently on our feeds where the whole UAP conference that takes place in Congress, and they're just basically discussing these different things and the technology associated with them and getting more information. There is mention of some of these UAPs that are doing this type of thing over the oceans where they're just coming down and you don't see any ripples in the water or anything like that, but there's just something going on there. I've talked with Reuben in the past where things just, these encounters that people have, they see these things descend right into the water and then they just come up from the water and they shoot off. It just really makes you wonder what's going on. I already mentioned rabbit holes. I'll add one more in here. Hollow Earth theory, being able to traverse through different points of the Earth and a whole large volume of space that's in the center of our planet. Maybe these things are flying in there. Who knows? But hopefully this information has been very educational and informative for you. This is the first time I actually heard about Old Ned, and I think it's very cool that this cryptid exists out there. And I love that there are so many similarities between these underwater cryptids and the commonalities that they share. I think that's very, very fascinating. And to me, seeing different reports come around from all over the country, not just in present day, but how they're recorded in the past, and seeing all these similarities between these cryptids, for me, it creates a much more prominent sense of realism and a degree of believability into these creatures. So there you have it. On the topic of what we're going to be getting to next week, I have an Encounters episode that will be returning. Special guest is going to be joining me to discuss their Sasquatch encounters and much more. So until then, you can find us on our website, CryptidClues.ca, our social media channels like X, formerly Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. And again, should you wish to reach out to us directly, you can send an email our way at cryptidclues@gmail.com. And that does it for today's episode, everyone. So take care and stay safe.